Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Hannah Yellen, a reader in media and culture and the chair of the Creative Industries Research and Innovation Network. And it's my pleasure to kick off our final day of the festival and welcome you all to this afternoon's talk, delivered by Simon Foxall and entitled Surreal Queer Utopia. Surreal Queer Utopias. And now let me tell you about our wonderful speaker, who it's an honour and a privilege to have here today. Simon Foxall is a British artist who's been based in Italy near Asti since 2020, where he has his studio. He was born in Saudi Arabia in 1983 and grew up in rural Worcester, hills and green woodland, before completing a BA in Fine Art Painting at Brighton University and an MA at Painting at the Royal College of Art in London. And he has frequently, our lucky students in fine art at Brookes used to benefit from his lecturing there as well. His works deal with queerness, otherness, surrealism, and the grotesque. The characters he creates explore contemporary and classic iconography, melted together, inspired by pop culture, drag queens, celebrity, fetish-wear, cowboys, comedy, neo-gothic, horror, fantasy, and bad taste, heavily influenced by the simultaneously flamboyant and earnest imagery of medieval, gothic, and neoclassical genres. He's just returned from a 5-week residency in Mexico, which included a ceramics residency in, I should have checked how to say this first, Cuernavaca?
Cuernavaca, yeah. Cuernavaca, yeah.
And culminating in the Zonamaco Art Fair at Alchemy Gallery in Mexico City. And if you want to buy Simon's work, he has an online show with Asti next week. And he's now preparing for a group show in Vermont in June and a solo exhibition in LA happening later this year. So welcome, Simon. It is absolutely wonderful to have you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, as always, to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to be talking today about surreal queer utopias, but also very much kind of about my practice as we go along. I'd like to start today with a quote from a book that seems to have been on everyone's reading list this year, and rightly so. Art Monsters, Unruly Bodies in Feminist Art by Lauren Elkin. In it, she quotes the American surrealist artist Dorothea Tanning in saying, "A woman had to be a monster to be an artist." This is one of life's really good quotes, I think. It elegantly infers the boundaries imposed on women, illuminating what one would be seen as if one transgressed them. The monster is the person who breaks the rules, or perhaps breaking the rules turns a person into a monster. I guess it depends who you are. Certainly, the only ones allowed to break the rules without being or becoming a monster are those who made them. When Hannah and I discussed doing this talk a long time ago, I said I would love to, then disappeared for a very long time to think about it. More on the mysteries of time later. Months later, she came back to me and said she needed to promote the session and did I have a title? I did not have a title. So we bandied the proverbial shuttlecock this way and that, considering the right framework within which to have a conversation about my practice, power and change, and hopefully find a title. And I think I said something about surrealism, queerness, and utopia. And she said, "How about surreal queer utopias?" And I said, "Yes, that's excellent," and came off the call. Surrealism, queerness, and utopia are deeply loaded conceptually, socially, politically, economically, sexually, metaphorically, spiritually. I could go on. But equally, they are profoundly subjective. I quickly realized I had absolutely no idea what surreal queer utopia actually meant and no idea how to talk about it. But I had a strong sense that I do talk about it in my paintings. While surrealism, queerness, and utopia are loaded and familiar terms, they are all in their essence a deep critique of fixity in all its shades. So having no idea what a surreal queer utopia might be was sort of the point, and the point that I'm leaping off from today. Surrealism is having a real moment right now. I mean, I think it's always having a moment. But having gone to art school in the noughties and early 2010s, at the height of zombie formalism, when identity was something to conceal, and I was asked by a fellow student at the Royal College of Art if I thought my work was a bit gay because I was drawing Sarah Michelle Gellar's hair. And during this current period of championing identity and individuality is something that I really want to savour and not take in the least bit for granted. During an RCA crit in 2011, I remember a different student saying that they thought the best art was when you couldn't tell anything about the artist from the work. Their gender, sexuality, heritage, age, everything was irrelevant and should be invisible. Art for art's sake, they said, and very much in the modernist utopian spirit, and art very much for the market at the time, which, still reeling from the financial crisis, was looking to stake a claim in the early 21st century ideals of a corporate tomorrowland, the utopia of steel and glass and grey interiors. Zombie formalism is perhaps what happens when you sleepwalk into a global recession and stumble away from the apparent certainty of economic, political, and social progress. I'm massively oversimplifying here, but in our current era of super subjectivity and its bandmates of surrealism, pop art, neo-expressionism sit very productively within a landscape of a collapsed trust in our systems of governance, a boom in the interest in nature, spirituality, witchcraft, the esoteric, and astrology. Astrology was once the preserve of slightly spooky people and Mystic May, an unsung diva of British TV in the 90s, whose evocative horror movie costumes, smoke machine, and melodious owl-like cooing voice trod the line between TV entertainment and cosmic prophecy, declaring in every way, from her presentation to her very clairvoyance, that she was not like anyone you knew in real life and wasn't meant to be. Reading a horoscope once prompted derisive comments like, "You don't really believe that, do you?" As if belief was a physical parameter, an actual line in the sand, a position to occupy and remain true to. Star signs now are made into memes, shared in their millions by websites and Instagram accounts like Bitch Rising, churning out hilarious zodiac content with no concrete sense at all of whether something is to be believed or not. Which Disney villain are you based on your star sign? Which Barbie character are you based on your star sign? Or my favorites, the signs as tweets. I love sending these to friends of mine who resolutely do not believe in star signs because it annoys them that they aren't quite sure if I do or not. But I'm a Scorpio, so I love that kind of mystery. Zodiac memes, like all memes, are a surrealist playground of meaning and myth-making. The gravity of belief isn't part of the game. It doesn't matter. Surrealism, too, is always about play, subjectivity, the non-permanence of meaning, and the big question mark at the end of every claim to certainty. As queerness is the question mark, it critiques the dominant social ideology. I'm not saying that star signs are surreal, although perhaps the cosmic is quite surreal simply by virtue of being kind of extra. But I am saying that surrealism both is melting clocks and isn't melting clocks. We all know that's surrealism. The surrealism with a capital S, the melting clocks, the lobster phone, and also things that are not by Dali. The often overlooked female surrealists have been getting a lot of love in recent years as critical discourse attempts to right its wrongs and expand our understanding of what this movement really meant. It can be funny, yes, but it's also dark and daring, an anti-fascist rallying cry, and an attempt to dismantle social norms by reveling in how gloriously unique we all are. However, despite these claims to the reverent dominion of the individual, in its cis-maleness, whiteness, and Eurocentrism, it was surprisingly conservative about some of the values of identity we take for granted today. As Katie Hessel writes in her amazing book, The Story of Art Without Men, the women of surrealism were drawn to it for its promise of freedom, its boundaryless space of expression, drawing on dreams, spirituality, and the body, despite the blatant misogyny of its male practitioners. Of course, the women were important. It was because they were our muses, They weren't artists, so claimed Roland Penrose, husband of Lee Miller, the legendary feminist Whitney Chadwick. When Chadwick later asked Leonora Carrington for her thoughts on the Surrealist muse, she replied, "I thought it was bullshit. I didn't have time to be anyone's muse. I was too busy rebelling against my family and learning to be an artist." So while Surrealism is historic, the surreal is not tied to that, as Leonora Carrington embodied. Surrealism was an energy to be taken and used for whatever purpose it was needed, often the expression and exploration of the self. Which is perhaps why the return of surrealism is something we're witnessing now, as selfhood has taken centre stage in art in recent years. And the alarming rise of fascism, the deepening brutality of 21st century capitalism, and its destruction of society and the planet is very much a sinister echo of the early 20th century. So it's perhaps no surprise it feels like such a relevant and mobile language to us currently. In 2022, I did a solo show with Alchemy Gallery in New York called Self-Portrait as a Thumb in a Storm, for which the amazing writer and artist Bronwyn Rowe wrote an exquisite essay entitled The Queer Grotesque about my body of work. She wrote, "The terror faced amid great calamity can, without a doubt, be pacifying. Nevertheless, when one looks at the hyperbole of horrors that characterize our current period, an endless pandemic, fascist resurgences, climate catastrophes, etc., it's hard not to laugh at the absurdity of it all. We laugh so as not to cry, or perhaps we laugh in tandem with our tears, as if they are two impulses of the same yoke." The humour that undergirds Simon Foxall's work shares its source with this same intuitive and primordial laughter roused in moments of terror and solemnity. These figures who dance amongst flames appear to relish in the heat. The flame's lick only energizes their entranced play. So where in all this horrific doom dancing is the queer utopia, I hear you ask? Good question. I don't know, but I think it's in the dancing. Of course, I don't really know what queer utopia is either, because while surrealism is busy playing havoc with meaning, seriousness, rational, logical thought, definition, and certainty, so too is utopia. Utopia definitely isn't dystopia. Of that we can be sure, right? Because utopia is framed as being in direct contrast to dystopia, which we talk about a lot. Dystopia makes the headlines with increasing regularity, reinforcing the notion that utopia is unachievable, a fantasy, idealistic, perhaps therefore childish, or at the very least privileged. While dystopia, initially intended to be equally fantastical, is reality and the ever-evolving present. We consider dystopia to be so effective at manifesting itself that the goalposts of fictional dystopia have to constantly move in order to keep up with just how bloody awful the real world feels. How often is dystopian art seen as predictive, in fact? 1984, Brave New World, Black Mirror, all said to be once fantasy, but now reality. Ursula K. Le Guin rallied against this idea of the science fiction novel as predictive, however, despite seeming to deal in the business of the future, in the introduction to her queer science fiction novel, The Left Hand of Darkness. She wrote, "Prediction is the business of prophets, clairvoyants, and futurologists. It's not the business of novelists. A novelist's business is lying. This book is not about the future. Yes, it begins by announcing that it is set in the ecumenical year 1490 to 97. And surely you don't believe that. Yes, indeed, the people in it are androgynous, but that doesn't mean I'm predicting that in a millennium or so we will all be androgynous. I'm merely observing, in the peculiar, devious, and thought experimental manner proper to science fiction, that if you look at us at certain odd times of the day, in certain weathers, we already are." I love this idea of science fiction as a thought experiment. It uses the future simply as a framework within which to remove the power structures that have shaped our world and see some gasp or glint of latent possibility in the present, as if it could fill the whole room. Since Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein in 1818, there has been a strong link between science fiction and neo-Gothic, or horror. Both are genres of exploding a limiting present in search of a voice, and from the outset, a gathering place for feminists and queer people. Neo-Gothic has always been a huge influence on my work, the spirit which is forever spinning its velvety web across every hyperbole of horrors that we face. Also, Neo-Gothic is very Scorpio. Kicking off as a reaction to the neuroses of the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, the Neo-Gothic dug back into the original Gothic, a period they felt was filled with ghosts and monsters and magic, darkness and decay, mysticism and the supernatural. To throw them back in the face of the super-rational age of enlightenment, which had spent 150 years suppressing all this creepy nonsense, but had seemed to lead into horror anyway. From the blood-stained streets of Paris during the Terror to the fire-breathing, smoke-pumping hellmouths of the new mills, Neo-Gothic seemed to say, this is the tomorrow that you have built with your logic, but at what cost? From here, Neo-Gothic continued to creep through time and deeper into our subconscious, reflecting the real-world terrors of rampant colonial expansion in the 19th century, the world wars, the Cold War era, the fear of nuclear oblivion, the AIDS crisis, and into the present day, virus pandemics, climate apocalypse, mass extinction, and social issues like white supremacy. This roster of terrific anxieties all find their expression in the art and later movies of the neo-Gothic or horror, pairing up logic and realism in order to express something truer. This disruptive use of the illogical is a provocation to logic, a great refusal. José Esteban Muñoz, in his book Cruising Utopia, discussed the great refusal as a pivotal mechanism in queer utopian impulse. Muñoz posits queerness as potentiality, something not yet here. Queerness is the refusal of the present, the refusal of pragmatism. Muñoz argues that as soon as something becomes pragmatic, it is no longer queer, because pragmatism is fed to us through what he refers to as straight time, from the past, through the present, into the future as a linear experience. A linear experience constructed socially and historically and therefore laden with its baggage. The societies in which we live, grow, and rebel are built from the limiting and stultifying architecture of capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. To comply within this structure isn't queer, he says. Queer time and queer experience are not linear and cannot be discussed in terms of the constructs built to oppose it. Queer time is disruptive and non-compliant, which is why I'm late everywhere. Muñoz states, in a quote that I would like printed on a crop top, the present is provincial. And when I show up late, I'm going to be wearing this crop top. The manifest present is a product of linearity and is therefore polluted. Perhaps one of the reasons dystopia is so unsettling is precisely because it is linear. It's so logical, it's so conclusive. The pervert. Emily Dickinson wrote, tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant, I think, is a really succinct way to capture both the neo-Gothic spirit and a certain queer energy. But one of the main points of neo-Gothic is that while it answers to the dystopian ghouls outside the window, it also spikes the utopian senses of thrill, excitement, pleasure, and even eroticism. It embodies this dichotomy as part of its foundational language. It's a poetic space. There are monsters, but they might be sexy. There is terror, but it might make us scream with some kind of joy. There's blood, but we want to party. It's like murder on the dance floor or something, which, since its use at the slightly perverse, very toxic, quite sexy end of queer neo-Gothic flip Saltburn, has absolutely been cemented as a queer anthem. As I mentioned before, these genres have always been feminist and queer, and from Mary Shelley onwards, the figures of the living dead have been one of its most potent and recurring motifs. Alessandro Grilli, in his essay Queering the Dead Gay Zombies in the Darkroom, discussed the huge, undeniable queer potential of this monstrous figure. He writes, Oh, I missed that slide. He writes, already from its oxymoronic definition as a living dead, the zombie invites a critical deconstruction of the parameters defining identity. Unlike garden variety monsters presenting themselves as completely other, the zombie is at the same time equal and different. As a consequence, the common denominator of death, a direct experience for the zombie, a certain expectation for the living, foregrounds and makes visible not so much the alien character of the monstrous as the monstrous streak lurking in all of us. Perhaps this is what Dorothea Tanning was talking about. But to become the monster, we must transgress, and we must transgress in order to exist fully, so therefore the monster was already there. As a proposition, queer utopia is powerful and highly emotive, as any theory around a utopia for marginalized people is. It's theorized in the face of tangible dystopian factors that impact people's lives in undeniable ways. Queer utopias can be theorized as places free of societal norms, free of gender, free of all forms of racism and xenophobia, free of economic inequality, free of fear, shame, isolation, and violence. And these utopian impulses, which are of course not only queer, have formed the base of radical politics and protest movements for generations and continue to do so. Positioning ourselves in opposition to and in constant critique of our provincial present is perhaps one of the only powers that we really have. Mystic Meg will have the last laugh. But I do wonder what she would have made of this glimpse of a potential Tomorrowland. New Fire Island. Now, I'm not a hater, but I do want to give a special shout out at this point to wealthy cis white gay men to say this. New Fire Island is not the vibe. I know that the island is a traditional symbol of utopia for many reasons, but let's take a look at this marketing right here. New Fire Island. We're bringing together a community of gay men to build a new paradise, inspired by the original Fire Island pines in the sunny Mediterranean and for a new era. None of this is a joke, by the way. So lots of nice words here, like bringing together and community and paradise. And I'm a sucker for the sunny Mediterranean. But already this place, which doesn't even exist yet, is directly stating that it's for gay men. None of your woke alphabet soup here, thank you very much. Then we dig a little bit deeper. In building New Fire Island, we're looking for others who want to join us on this journey. Together we will find a site, design it, and build the place of our dreams. From the West Village to West Hollywood, everyone knows that when the gays get together to build a village, magic happens and the prices skyrocket. So let's get together, find an island, and build paradise. Okay, so earlier I stated that I don't know what a queer utopia is, but thanks to New Fire Island, I now at least know what it isn't. The icky blend here of utopian speak with more than a touch of colonizer spirit, relative privilege, and the frank projection that this privilege can bring economic benefits that would exclude others, is made more perturbing by the elimination of queerness in favor of cis-gay maleness. Now, sure, a few decades back, the gay male body, as a queer body, sat very much outside of capitalism, as it stood outside of society. But that is no longer always the case. Now we need to analyze and attend to our complicity in late capitalism and be mindful of the profound limits of capitalism's acceptance of queerness. As radical lesbian activist group Fierce Pussy noted in 2009, queers may be more visible, but the city and our country have become far more fundamentally conservative. Today, gay visibility, which is more about assimilation and gay marriage, has replaced queer visibility and a vision of radical social change. Whether or not same-sex marriage is radical or conformist is a divisive question. I think it is ultimately conformist, but I also deeply believe that it's important that it exists. I'm not against anything and would never be against anything that makes the lives of queer people safer and happier. But I do think it's both productive and important to critique the ways in which the drive for LGBTQA+ equalities and assimilation led to significant splits under the umbrella of queerness, with cis white gay men having access to quite radically different social experiences than other members of our queer family. Such schisms have always existed, and they have done for millennia, but we don't have to keep feeding them if we don't want to. We have a choice. We can and should work towards dismantling, but we can't achieve that by assimilation, especially when many are still considered socially too queer to assimilate. This is one point from which I explore the utopian in my work, as a cis gay man who makes pictures, basically. I'm an image maker. I believe in images. I love their limitations and their failures. I love their stasis and their fixity, and finding ways to slip between the gaps of these boundaries. The will it, won't it destroy humanity shitstorm currently raging around AI has opened another great can of worms regarding the failure of images. Some theorize that AI will create a world in which everyone believes everything, even if it's fake. Others theorize that AI will lead to a world in which no one believes anything, even if it's real. I tend to believe the latter is more likely as people become increasingly exposed to AI images flooding every sphere. The idea that no one will believe images, even if they are real, is a kind of reopening of the millennia-long function of images that we have only quite recently, since the invention of the camera, lost touch with. This is that the image was never meant to be real. Before the camera, the image was instinctively understood to be a lie. And this was not a problem. The problem of image being a lie is a modernist concern, beginning in the West with artists like Courbet, Turner, Cézanne, and Monet. If AI does in fact not dupe us all like sheep into believing into total fictions, but instead returns us to a collective consciousness in which image is understood not to be real, then we are called instead to reconsider image as being about codes and significance, meaning and myth-making. This isn't anything new, but it's been a continuing energy in art throughout modernism as it was before, but perhaps it illuminates these functions in a less ambiguous way. Myth-making is an ever-present interest in my practice, and the debt I owe to classical and neoclassical traditions is very apparent. I trawl images of old paintings online, in books, in galleries, for compositional ideas, backgrounds, details. These sources are springboards, formally rather than conceptually. As I mentioned, I love playing with the limitations of image in its deployment of trickery and illusion, symbolism and reference. Figurative painting is always engaging with the fertile falsehood of image making. When the Renaissance rediscovered Venus, they recycled her. Unaware and unconcerned about how pagan art might have been read by pagan society, unaware and unconcerned about how their image culture and sex-gender system were completely different. The Renaissance repurposed classicism to its own ends: gesture and pose, flesh and cloth, sense and sensuality were all just pinballs in the game, ready to be flicked all over the place in search of a lie that tells a truth. In a similar way, I look at a painting of Eros and of Cupid and Psyche simply because there's something about the framing and the composition of a painting of them, the energy, the touch, the plasticity, that sparks an idea of where I could take it, such as this work titled after the Bee Gees song You Win Again. The work ends up as a kind of collage that from fragments becomes a whole new thing. I'm interested in the idea of collage as a kind of parasitic language, one that occupies its sources and takes them over, leaving traces of associative meaning in their wake as they carve out something new. Artist Mickalene Thomas refers to collage as code switching, something she harnesses as a queer woman of colour working with the very loaded archetype of the female nude, occupying, questioning, reforming a space initially hogged almost entirely by heterosexual white men. Thomas's code switching is framed in her practice as a way of taking control of the wheel, while simultaneously reminding us of the reasons that control needed to be taken in the first place. Her work, in many ways, embodies the inherent contradictions and problems within the utopian impulse around image making. that the outline of the new world we want to see has been drawn by the one we really don't. My practice is predominantly a practice of nude figures as well. But while they are in part absolutely about eroticism and desire, I don't consider them to be erotic. Characters often look out at the viewer, poses are often awkward and contrived, smiles are forced, and often uniform. If it weren't for the nudity, volcanoes, and surrealist landscapes, they would have more in common with a family photo taken on film camera than they would with Tom of Finland. And at this point, I'm afraid we have to talk about Tom of Finland. He was the architect of one of the most pervasive visions of gay male sexuality in the 20th century, creating a hyper-macho utopia of gigantic men in which homophobia simply doesn't exist. Now, in the context of history, these works, created in a time when homosexuality was still illegal, was pretty radical. Emotion also doesn't exist. They are super stud sex machines and always in a very good mood. Also quite radical, given the prevalent stereotype of the sad queer throughout the 20th century. And imperfection doesn't exist. That is, if we take our idea of imperfection from the ancient Greeks, which Tom did, and we still continue to do in many cases to this day. This is by far the strongest symbol of the capitalist body, too. This lineage from classicism through Tom of Finland to Instagram fitness influencers would also perhaps be categorized within Munoz's idea of straight time. And this is something that I try to disrupt in my paintings. There are bodybuilders and jocks and studs all over the place, but none of them are quite pulling it off. Also, Tom's men have enormous penises, which is definitely not ancient Greek. I tend to underplay the phallocentrism of my characters, hoping to look beyond the phallocentric reading of the male nude body, which can also be disruptive, I discovered. I once had a gay male friend say to me, "Why don't you paint bigger cocks? That's what we want." So I said, okay, and I painted these, but apparently that was also wrong, so I don't know what people are looking for. I'd like at this point to return back to Bronwyn Rowe's essay. The thread of fluidity and transmutation runs deep throughout Foxall's work, not only in his imagery, but in his practice as well. Tom of Finland's idealized and hypersexed studs are amputated, contorted, cartoonish, and their sex diminutive in Foxall's figures. The archetypal image of the cis male body is here hyperbolated to the point of dislodging the latter's privileged position, opening a space for a more universalizing queer aesthetic. It's very important to underline here that while Tom of Finland's work occupies an important and pivotal role in the canon of queer aesthetics, there are also many, many reasons to criticize his work. His utopia and aesthetic are deeply exclusive, very cis-male, and very white. I also think it's important to regard it functionally, that while Tom's world was a deep subversion of the male wasp social system of Northern Europe and the US, and provided transgressive pleasures and self-visualization in private, it was a trans woman of color who started the Stonewall riots. Taking their utopian battle for equality for all queers out of the relative privacy of the closet and onto the streets of 1960s New York. I don't want to create a false equivalence here between these two narratives. There's room for both, but it's perhaps another example of those who are too queer to assimilate, having nowhere to hide. But I do love Tom of Finland's work, even if I know it's bad for me. It was very formative, and I continue to be in a kind of dialogue with the world he helped to make visible, a dialogue of contradictions, a dialogue slanted. Legend has it that Marsha P. Johnson threw the first brick. Throwing a brick, a tool of construction used to deconstruct a toxic present, brings me back to Munoz's idea of the great refusal. The refusal of law, the refusal of body, the refusal of white supremacy, the refusal of gender, the refusal of the capitalist method of organizing the human body into commodity. That refusal is utopian, because I think utopia only really makes sense when it doesn't make sense. I think utopia can only really exist in the mind because pragmatism would pollute it and individuality would tear it apart. The present is provincial, just as we're constantly reminded, the present is dystopian. So utopia is the thought experiment that both keeps us sane and keeps us crazy. The fact that utopia only makes sense if it doesn't make sense perhaps also makes utopia surreal. Or perhaps it's surreal because the real is provincial. Or perhaps saying this is a total cop-out, like at the end of the movie when it all turns out to be a dream. So I won't quite leave it there. In my work, the tool of queer utopia contains the collapse of binary, be that of gender, tragedy, comedy, or even the supposed opposition between utopia and dystopia. Maybe they aren't so different after all. Both utopia, surrealism, and some theories on queerness deal in the fantastical. And at the root of fantasy is often this very collapse of the binary between utopia and dystopia, not presenting the ideal and the terrible as opposing forces, but conjoined inevitabilities of the human imagination and experience. In my paintings, everyone smiles, even if they're crying. Landscapes are both beautiful and cloying, sweeping and inaccessible, picturesque and polluted. And everyone is trying far too hard. Nudes are freely interchanged with clothed figures. Figures implying known persons sit with imagined ones. Penises, when visible, are never phallic. Sexualities present themselves sexlessly. There is no sex. For pleasure or procrastination. Procrastination, that was a Freudian slip. For pleasure or procreation, occurring in any of the works. There's no fun, really, despite the hysteria, and there's almost no action. I feel like a neo-goth with the inclination of a neoclassicist, playing with the language of space and corporeal intimacy without connection to each other or really to us. The figures are not really people. They are like painted objects, statues, painted paintings, deeply imperfect images of perfection, as Le Guin said. Artists are liars. And in this catalogue of characters with no place and time, the utopian impulse to reflect the present and reflect myself is fluttering around somewhere between the pages. Right at the end of this talk is a great time to slip in that I don't want to claim some high function or logic for my work. There's a lot of doing first and thinking later going on, which makes grand claims of purpose and conceptual intent something of a joke. But there is a territory. Call it surreal queer utopia, if you like, and I'm wading around in it, wondering why.
That's tremendous, Simon.
Thanks.
Thank you. I just love the way that you talk about your work and just meld so many references. It's really just tremendous. I have like more questions, sensible questions, thought out questions written down than we're going to have time for. But really, having listened to your talk, what I want to ask you is, I hear you paint Sarah Michelle Gellar's hair. Is your work a bit gay?
It was one of those moments that what I find really funny is that this kind of moment has like grown in my mind over the years, not because I've changed anything about the situation, there's very little of it to change, but just because I didn't notice at the time how weird it was. And that's what I find really strange. And I remember, and I don't want to throw the RCA under the bus. It's a fantastic institution and I had a great time there. But I remember when I started doing a PhD, which I quit, I think perhaps we could call this queer time. When I started doing a PhD there in 2016, I remember being told by one of the supervisors that if I wanted a supervisor in queer theory, then I could obviously find one outside the institution and bring them in because, you know, we don't really know about that stuff. And I was it's a bit like, I think, was it like in the 1980s that's like queer theory kind of gained ground? So it's kind of an interesting sort of reflection on how I hadn't noticed that things were not as advanced as perhaps they could have been. But the last 10 years has been so rapid that 2010 feels like a lifetime ago.
So Dottie Clay, thank you, Dottie. Kicks us off by asking, how do you place queerness in the frame of counterculture? And she which she
I
elaborates
just,
to
as
say,
in, yeah.
timely there, as in does the counterculture, which deals with ostensibly creating utopias and highlighting dystopia and having its surreal components, the yuppies, for example, trying to elect a pig as governor of California, and memes, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, like, I also feel like, I should kind of caveat everything by sort of saying that, like, I've got obviously some opinions on these things, but I don't know how a sort of an academic might answer it, but my kind of feeling about it is that, you know, I think that I kind of grew up, as probably lots of queer people did, with the idea that queerness was countercultural because perhaps that made more sense, in the 20th century. And I think that kind of thinking about the sort of New Fire Island element of it, it almost feels a bit like the kind of the yuppies in California or the yuppies in New Fire Island. It sort of feels a little bit like the belief that queerness on its own is countercultural. And I think in the kind of Munoz argument that queerness doesn't exist, that queerness is this kind of provocation to all kinds of presentness, then that is countercultural. But that's not what these people are talking about. They have this idea that, you know, like counterculture is real estate, you know. So I think it's a really tricky one where I feel like, certainly in my work anyway, imagery relating to counterculture is it's something that I use a lot, the kind of, as we mentioned before about the drag queens and cowboys and fetish wear and, the kind of, you couldn't really call them medieval countercultural, maybe you could nowadays. But there's but yeah, the monsters and ghosts and demons, all of this kind of countercultural imagery. I like to sort of use that as a language, but I don't feel like that on its own is doing the work. And I wonder if that's where we kind of consider queerness in going forward, in this kind of world we have now where it's very much about equality drives relating to assimilation, whether the inherent countercultural nature of queerness just isn't, yes, plenty of queerness is countercultural still, but it's not a kind of guarantee. So yeah, how I would place it, I feel like it's something where those two things that once seemed really locked together no longer are, but they have a kind of a sort of a skirting relationship to one another. But we risk quite a lot when we assume that queerness is inherently countercultural, and therefore we don't have to worry about the part we're playing in non-countercultural.
Thank you. So that ties to something that I wanted to ask you about, because you made a really nice, you really showed the interweaving with how surrealism has been associated with pushing boundaries. Utopianism, is about building, alternate kind of imagined possibilities. I'm really interested in what kind of reality your work is really world building. So what kind of alternate reality are you constructing here, or would you construct, if it were consistent with your project, maybe not just, as back to that thought experiment that you were talking about.
I feel like, so I suppose kind of bringing it back into the paintings, I kind of feel like I suppose I feel a bit like I don't have a way of doing that in any kind of sort of positive sense. And I think that that sounds really pessimistic. I don't mean that at all, but as in, I think the kind of the limitation and the impossibility is the kind of productive seedbed in which other things are happening. So I sort of feel like with my paintings, for example, the kind of inherent failure of them to function is is the point. And in a way, I feel like, on a kind of with the work that I've been making, for example, in the last 4 years, which is when I kind of feel like I found a real kind of voice with what I was trying to do. Prior to that, I'd spent, almost the last 20 years making a lot of paintings. And coming from the sort of kind of a background of looking at art history and looking at a lot of very successful paintings in which paintings work terribly well at things. Um, I found that to be something which I didn't realize was the very thing that was in the way. And so I feel like in terms of what I would like to see, I think what I would like to see is maybe everybody getting behind the idea of not needing to see everything, as in like in the sense that, maybe that kind of need to solidify and consolidate is the very obstacle. However, caveat always that with the fact that, like I said, visions of queer utopia are based on really important tangible factors around safety. And so, talk about it like, oh, it doesn't matter, and let's just keep it all as a thought experiment is also potentially reckless. So I want to kind of be absolutely clear that I don't consider those two things to be mutually exclusive, you know. But with the work, I would say it's about the not working, it's about the not fulfilling. And that I'm hoping that within the inability to fulfill the promise, we kind of have another conversation. That doesn't mean that the political systems that govern our society should aim for failure, because they are doing that and it isn't working.
Right.
So,
I want to give you the opportunity, because we're talking about your work in relation to these terms, surreal, queer, and utopia. And as you said at the beginning, that's actually something we just devised because we were trying to make that link between what you do and the theme of the festival, that is power and change. So I just wanted to give you the opportunity to kind of discuss how that has and hasn't been productive and comfortable for you to think about your work in these terms, how it does and doesn't fit, because I feel like I invited you to make it fit. So let's kind of
I mean,
make space for the friction.
you were as ever an enabler. You didn't like I kind of came up with the words and you said, well, that works. Let's go with that. So I mean, like you're very much an enabler, but you weren't putting words in my mouth. But I think that one of the things that I have found, to talk about sort of, the paintings and to talk about it from the perspective of being an artist, it was a really interesting thing happened during the pandemic. During the pandemic was really when this work kind of began to come together, and I'd spent years trying to figure out where my language lay and what it was I was trying to do. And over the past few years, I've kind of, in the past 15 years, I've given talks at various points about my work, and I had a really good elevator pitch. Like, you know, um, I'm not shy in talking, if you get me on the right subject. And, like 10 years ago, you could have asked me about my work and I'd have been like, da, 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 da. And then I started making work that I felt was really right for me, which is the work that I began making about 4 years ago. And at that point, my ability to talk about it just disappeared into thin air. And I became a complete idiot. Every time I opened my mouth about the work, I'd bumble and be like, I genuinely don't really know what to say. Whereas I'd never had a problem. And I think there was something kind of interesting for me in the point at which the work that I was getting a lot of positive feedback. Friends of mine who followed my work for 20 years said, "Oh, this is like this feels like you. This feels like you've really found something." And I was like, "Great. Wish I knew what to say about it because yeah, I'm really struggling, and I think that the the process of actually putting this talk together has been hugely productive because I have a stack of books behind me on my table, which are the ones that I've been kind of going through when I was finding references, all of which are books I already own, all of which were things that I bought years ago, knowing that they fitted somewhere into how I felt about stuff. Um, but actually, as an opportunity to consolidate things, the writing of this talk has been hugely helpful. So I'm very grateful for that. Thank you very much. So
No,
far from having words put in my mouth, I feel like as I say, as an enabler, a very productive one, to give me a really good excuse to spend the last couple of weeks actually taking a deep dive into what I've been doing and actually genuinely struggling to talk about.
Well,
So
it's
yeah,
entirely we are the beneficiaries of that process. So, we're very lucky. Thank you. There's a comment in the chat here from Chris Mapleston who asks, how has your move to Italy affected your paintings?
that's a really good question. Do you know, when I moved to Margate, I moved to Margate in 2014, and then there was a friend of mine there from the RCA, and he'd recently moved from London too. And he came about a year after me, and I was and he said, like, how are you finding like leaving London and living in Margate? And and I said, I really feel like Margate's kind of like getting into the work. And he was like, you're not like painting seashells, are you? And I was like, well, firstly, I would very much paint seashells. But no, that's not what I mean. What I mean is it's this kind of liminal space, this sort of permissive, the seaside town is this kind of historically permissive space that I felt like this was seeping in. And then in 2019, I moved to Barcelona and spent a year there just before the pandemic. And I felt like this kind of that's when everyone started getting really awkward tan lines because do you know who else had awkward tan lines, right? So, I there's this kind of element of the sea, sun, and sangria stereotype of Spain, which obviously I was living beyond because I actually lived there, but I was as a British person in Spain, I had this kind of historic weight of the sea, sun, sangria stereotype, and that filtered into the work as well. And moving to Italy, which I did in June 2020, almost 4 years. Definitely has had a big impact. I think there's the obvious things like, I live, I live in the middle of the woods, in a very, very quiet place. There's a lot of that kind of deep tranquility, which I had growing up, but other things were not tranquil about that. I was, I had a difficult time with myself as a teenager. So living in tranquility, in the sort of surrounded by green and nature and peace and quiet as an adult has been a very different experience. Also, of course, the history of art and architecture here. It's kind of that kind of that the fact that you're looking at something medieval next to something Renaissance, and it's just all sitting there, no one really paying that much attention to it, just there because it is that sense of these signifiers kind of lying around to be used or not used as you will. And the other thing that I think is interesting on a kind of cultural level is that coming from a kind of queer culture in the UK, which is obviously very established, very visible, very catered to, then coming to Italy and Spain, also Barcelona, again, a very established queer scene in Barcelona. And coming to Italy, I'm not living in Milan, I'm not living in Rome, I'm living in rural Piemonte. So, the queer scene, it exists a lot. There's a lot of queer people everywhere. It is visible. But, there aren't really gay bars because everybody's just together and having an aperitivo, or there's not really, there's a kind of sense of there being something less marketed to. Now, that comes with its own challenges because, we currently have a government in Italy that is very, very right wing and very homophobic, amongst lots of other horrible things. So, to say that there isn't an established queer scene isn't something which I would consider on its own to be a positive. However, it has been an interesting thing to see how queer people are living confidently and openly, but in a much less defined sense. And I think that sense of kind of slippage and a lack of definition has also found a place in the work a little bit.
Now, my research is on celebrity culture, so I'll never miss an opportunity to chat about it. And you didn't show us your celebrity paintings today, did you? But you've got some great work on Princess Diana, Tom Selleck, Amanda Lepore. I really would like to own that Amanda Lepore watercolor. So, I mean, in your talk, you draw upon such breadth, the kind of cultural influence, high and low. I mean, we'll give those some scare quotes. What does celebrity culture? What is what are you drawing upon there, and especially with these particular figures, characters that you're drawn to? There's something superlative or, you know, larger than about each of those figures, isn't there?
I think, yeah, I think it's something kind of transcendental as well. I think that, you know, they're also kind of, I mean, they are to me anyway, transcendental because, you know, like a bit woo-woo in my old age. But I think that, you know, the thing with Princess Diana, I saw a great painting recently, actually. I was at My Art, the art fair in Milan, 2 weeks ago, and there was a painting there, um, clearly of Princess Diana, and it was titled The Friendliest Ghost. And I was like, how do I do that thing? Like the heart. I was like, it's such a beautiful, like such a beautiful, the friendliest ghost. I was like, she would be as well, wouldn't she? Like the hottest and the friendliest, and you don't get that combination together very often. So I mean, Princess Diana, yeah, I didn't show that painting. It's over in the corner here. But yeah, like I did a painting of Princess Diana as this kind of sort of much more aged, but with this very long tongue, with like a little butterfly sitting on the end, because I've been listening to a lot of Dolly Parton, and that will also have an effect. And this idea of her as a symbol to of firstly of kind of like a specificity of history and identity, you know, particularly given sort of how our ideas of governing powers, you know, have changed since the 90s. You know, of course, Diana occupied a very specific role as a real person in a real system. But since then has become, you know, she's the sort of Marilyn Monroe of royalty, isn't she? You know, forever young, forever gorgeous, forever the victim. And I think that as in that sense, she, yeah, the friendliest ghost, but also the person to whom like everybody can automatically feel this kind of sense of, you know, love for. So painting her, I think when I remember being at high school looking at Andy Warhol's Marilyns and being told you cannot paint Marilyn Monroe and being, damn it. I didn't as well. I didn't paint her. But you know, but painting Princess Diana feels like my chance to do that, to be like Warhol painting as Marilyn. You know, it's kind of there's something transcendental, and I think that Tom Selleck as well. You know, is thinking about him as a kind of contrast in a way to the Tom of Finland actors. You know, because they've all got the big moustaches and they're terribly macho, but Tom Selleck is somebody who um, he's kind of like I think he's the real Superman. You know, he's the real like, not Tom of Finland, which, as I say, was formative as a youth. I'm not going to lie, but you know, but Tom of Finland is so extreme and really is not to everybody's taste. Tom Selleck is to everybody's taste. I mean, who isn't in love with Tom Selleck? You know, I mean, it's kind of, and I don't think I think that any human being who can embody that should be celebrated.
That's great. I think that brings us to time. It's been absolutely such a pleasure, Simon. Really, really
Thank you, Rachel. It's been a pleasure for me
fantastically,
too. Thank you so much.
yeah, really, really interesting, really great to see your work. So please, everybody, join me in thanking Simon, and we'll see you later today, hopefully.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming, everyone. Thank you.